Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out to be here. And thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. I'm convinced the audience thinks we bribed you guys for saying all those things about us. But really, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm very excited to be a part of what promises to be a very invigorating discussion on the pros and cons of a set series. Before we start, some housekeeping rules. Please put your phones on silent, and we'll take questions at the end of the session. Um, Now, as the moderator for the panel, I have the advantage of having the panelists and all of you at my whim and fancy for the next 35 minutes. So I'm just going to start by a question. When I was told that I'll be a part of this panel, I was very excited, and one of the first things I did was to look up the 20 best-selling children's books of all times. And I'd like anyone from the audience would like to take guesses on which books made the cut. No, unfortunately, Alice in Wonderland wasn't there. It's a wonderful book. But yes, so the first 7 were Harry Potter. So J.K. Rowling has hit the ball, not just out of the park, but out of the solar system, I think. 450 million copies sold. Any guesses? So that is a series, as you know. So the first 7 were taken by her. Any guesses on a few other names that you think would be in that list? And this is like an all-time best-selling list. No, actually, Roald Dahl was missing too, but I'll give you a few names. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Eric Carle, sold 35 million copies. Pokey Little Puppy by Janet Sebring sold 11 million. Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter, 9.3 million. And of course, Dr. Seuss, who's a big favorite, Green Eggs and Ham, 8 million copies. And then, I don't know if anyone's read this book. I mean, I'm sure many of you have. I cry every time I read it. Love You Forever by Robert Munsch. That's 7.9 million copies. So, you know, what I was saying is there's clearly room for, a series and for standalone books, because a good book is a good book, regardless of what there is. And I think we're very lucky to have 2 prolific writers today on the panel who both have successfully written book series and standalone books they have been nominated for and won several awards. So I'm really going to start by asking the audience first and then come to the panelists that what is a favorite book series that you remember reading when you were a child that really stayed with you, that created some magical moments for you? Would anyone like to share?
Hello.
Yes, the lady in the white. Noddy. Noddy was a favorite.
Series books per se. And after Noddy, I think we went on to reading Enid Blyton, Nancy Drew, and then obviously you get distracted with so many other books which you come across in your teen years. But the Noddy is something which stuck in the mind, and even till date, I can really get hooked to some of these Noddy books.
It's fantastic. Would anyone else like to share? Yes, I see a hand here. Ah, yes. Yeah. So what did Tintin do for you? What was so lovable about Tintin?
Basically something I didn't do. I always read in those books and feel, oh yes, this is something which can be done.
Fantastic. Anyone else would like to share? Yes.
The Mallory series, Enid Blyton. So I was in a boarding school, so I really liked reading how this girl went to the boarding school and how her life changed there. She didn't like going, and then she really got settled.
So that resonated with you?
Yes.
Fantastic.
So, yeah. The Faraway Trees, another series I really liked.
Yes,
the Magic
it's a wonderful
Faraway Tree.
series. Yeah. So I'd like to ask our panelists, both David and Natasha, that, what makes a good book series, and what is a series that's really stayed with you, and what did the character or the story do for you?
Can anyone hear me? Yeah. Well, the series that springs to mind for me was Asterix and Obelix, the graphic novels. I really love those, and probably the illustrator in me, I used to love the drawings a lot, so I used to copy those, but I used to love the character in the drawings. But I love that world, and I think there's a sort of, I don't know if it's it's in retrospect now, I think that there's a comfort in going back to the familiar, and I loved the new book coming out, and the world and the characters. Sorry, what was the other question you asked me? What makes a good series? I guess that I suppose each one was a standalone story within the series. So for me, the attraction was the characters and that world. I mean, obviously, you can get a series that's a bit like a Harry Potter series, which is a development, and each book is a continuation of a story, which has probably more of an attraction, I guess. I don't know, for some readers. But I think it's just the reader identifying in some way with that world and just drawn to that familiar, enjoyable familiarity of their characters. I think when you hook onto a series, it's just really exciting to wait for the new one, and I think that's a big draw. I remember thinking that, and my son read a series, and he was the same. He loved the next one coming out, and he read them back to back, and I don't know, that was my thinking.
I think largely a lot of the things that he mentioned, there is primarily, I feel, the comfort factor of going back to a familiar world and familiar characters. And just, you know, in terms of series and broadly, if I was just to think of it, one being the ones where there is a progression from one book to the other. There is always that draw, and that's really what gets those lines outside bookstores the night before the release, as we saw happening with each Harry Potter book, where you really wanted to know what happens next. So from a writer's perspective, that's brilliant because, you know, you have to do a lot less work in marketing it. From a reader's perspective, there's really that big hook. If I look back to the series that I loved, Asterix and Obelix is actually a current favorite as well. If I find one that I don't have in my collection, I will still pick it up. Another one that comes to mind in a similar format is Calvin and Hobbes. And I think I've returned to it in very different ways as a child. It was just funny. Today I see my own children in the book, and that's what brings that draw to me. The Mallory Tars series was, which you mentioned, was a big draw because I wasn't in hostel at that time, and you know, it was sort of living it out in a different way. So a lot of them, if I think back to myself, it's always that emotional connection that you develop with your reader, and you become so invested in their life that you want to know more about it, and that's really the big draw of a series, I feel. Yeah.
That's true, actually. I like what you said about the emotional connect. That makes a big difference. So if you both could talk a bit about how you got the idea for your series. So when you got the idea of the character or the story, was it for one book? Or was it as a series right at the beginning? And if it was just one book, how did the idea come about? And when and why did you think of making it into a series?
So actually the two big series that I'm doing, one, the History Mystery, in which I've written 5 books, and the Good Indian Child's Guide, which currently is slated to be at least 4. Their evolution was completely different. I tend to typically write a lot of standalones. However, I have written almost 9 in different series today. The History Mystery series actually had a very strange origin. I was in a writing workshop for my publishers, and it was on writing chapter books. We were asked to pick a genre that we'd never considered writing in, and I picked historical fiction. And to my great horror, we were given a prop that had to feature in the story, and the prop that I put my hand into the bag and pulled out was a sock. And I just looked at it and I was completely horrified, and I said, you know, historical fiction and a sock. And they were kind enough to say, well, feet, footsteps, you know, you can broaden it a bit. To shorten it, I mean, to cut the story short, I basically ended up writing this story about a 1,300, 1,500 word story, which centered around Akbar, because I was the most familiar with Akbar, having read it a lot in history. And that, at the end of that workshop, the publishers said, we really like the concept, we like the basic plot, would you like to flesh this into a book for us? And I did, with no thought of putting it into a series at that point of time. When I wrote that first book, they said, you know, this concept, what you've put together in terms of historical fiction, but it's full of facts, and at the end of the book, it tells you that, well, these things are based on fact. We think there's a gap in the market at this age group and for this content, and we'd really like to consider it as a series, and would you be open to it? And of course, those are sort of like golden words at that point of time. So I said yes, and I wrote the next book on Ashoka, and we released 2 together. And that's the origin for that. With the Good Indian Child's series, I started with the idea of mangoes, but very quickly, even as I was writing that, I got another idea for cricket. And at that point, instinctively knew that I can develop this into a series. And I have a really good sense of the kind of characters and the theme that I want to press on with. So I think if you have that broad idea, there are some that I write, and I just can't imagine putting it, you know, into a series at that point of time. But two completely different origins, and I'm sure David will have.
That's fantastic. But David, sorry, before you start, I'm never going to look at a sock the same way now. Now, David, for you, I mean, you have illustrated more than 100 books, out of which you've written sort of 60. So it would be very interesting to hear your story as well on how you got these ideas.
So for me, usually I don't think I've ever consciously gone in looking to do a series ever. And even with Hughless Douglas, it wasn't like that. But usually what happens with my books is that I would finish a book and there would be a character or an incident in the story I'd done that my designer or publisher I'd be working with, my editor, would suggest would be a good setting point to do something else. And it's very natural, very organic. It wasn't an obvious thing. It would be, oh, I really like that character in the background, you know. So that would be, most times, the way of doing it. But with Douglas, when Douglas came along, it was absolutely meant, my intention was as a standalone. And the idea for the story came, my son would hate me saying this now, he's 14 now, but at the time he was 4. And the suggestion was there was a bear in a previous book that people had said, oh, you've never done a book with a bear in, because my books are picture books for young kids. So I thought, okay, so I started using a sketchbook. The way I work is I start drawing ideas, drawing characters. And I started drawing this bear. And over 2 or 3 days, I was thinking bear stories, drawing lots of bears. And in the evening, I would be reading a story to my son when he went to bed. And we had this parallel couple of days where when I'd finished a story, he yawned and I gave him a hug. And I said, oh, that's a tired hug. And then he said, yeah, I'm giving you a tired hug. It was something like that. And the next morning, he remembered that and he said, I want to give you a breakfast hug. It was a kind of a take on hugs, I don't know. And we just carried on this silly little game of, I can't find my socks hug, that type of thing. It was a kind of thing. And then I'd go to work and think, stories with bears, stories with bears. And then after a while, I thought, actually, bears, bear hugs, there's got to be something in that. And, you know, I didn't leap very far, and I thought, a bear looking for a hug. So that was it. That was the idea for the story. And that was it. It was supposed to be a one-off story. And the reason it developed is that it did incredibly well very quickly. And then my publisher, with the spirit of commercial view on these things, said, you know, we should really think about doing another one of those. And that's the first time I think, I haven't done many series in my picture books. I think The Kiss That Missed was one of 3 books in a series of nights, but there were 2 or 3, there were gaps between each of those books. But the idea was to do another one straight away, and I did, and another one, and another one. And in my 25-year career, Douglas came along 10 years ago, and I've just finished book 11. And I think I've done 3 or 4 spin-off books. So there's about, I think, 18, Hughless Douglas related books in the last 9 years, which is a lot of material for one book. Yeah.
So, you know, Natasha, you touched on the fact that marketing becomes easier if you have a series. And David, you were mentioning that the publishers are very excited about a series. So could you talk a bit about, does a series work from an author's point of view in terms of allowing you to really get into a character and sort of lose yourself and then develop that character and stories? You know, is it a very creative process? And also, as a reader, you know, is it a hook, especially for reluctant readers, you know, who are not picking up books, but if they see a series they like, and like you mentioned earlier, David, that they're waiting for the next one, you know, that can be exciting for them. And also as a publisher, I mean, they see a steady stream of business. So what are your views on this?
So I'll just say, sorry, I'll just jump on that. It just immediately thought to me. So as a writer, an illustrator, it was great at the beginning because for a couple of books, I became quite familiar with the world, so then I could explore the character a bit more. But one thing I did miss, and I have missed over the last 9 years, I have to say, and it's been a very happy journey doing Douglas books, don't get me wrong, is that for me, one of the most enjoyable parts of my process is to spend at least 3 or 4 weeks with a sketchbook, drawing and exploring that world or the new world that I would come into, and just seeing where it would take me. So after 2 or 3 books, I started to not do that process because I didn't need to. The world was there, the characters was there. I might introduce a new character. So I started narrowing my creative process at the beginning of that, each stage. And I've missed that, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly as more and more books have come out. And I've realized that's kind of narrowed my way of working in a way. And I think you can draw a parallel, I think, to some extent with the reading side of things as well, because as a reader of a series, you can really enjoy it at the beginning. It can be quite engaging, or very engaging, of course. But then after a while, for some readers, I guess it could become possibly too much of a comfort thing, and a reluctance to move away from that. So my son, he enjoyed a series very much, and it was a 13-book series, Cherub by Robert Muchamore. And by the end of that series, he said, I'm never going to find a series as good as this. So he really, so he started to slow down when he got to about book 10. And the first 10, he must have read, well, in a couple of months. He really worked his way through them. And then he just slowed right down. He was very reluctant to finish the last one. And I said, well, there'll be other series out there. You'll find, yeah, but nothing like this. I'm sure they won't be the same. And to this day, he has said that. He hasn't been the same. And so it can narrow you down a little bit, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I think to add to that, my two series, The Good Indian Child's Guide and The History Mystery, just as a writer, they're very different in their format. With The Good Indian Child's Guide, there are particular characters. There is a very specific voice and style of writing. It's almost spoofing the topic that I'm writing about, whether it's eating mangoes or playing cricket. So when I wrote the mango book and I sort of got the idea for the cricket, I found the cricket book was really quick to write because I already had pretty much a formula, even though the content would be completely different. But there was basically a good structure in place. And I wrote that. In the History Mystery series, each story it's sort of like, it's not a character-based series. And each story is set in a different part of Indian history. The key characters are different. I have to build an entire world, even though I know that the voice and the style of writing, the length, the age group, and a person who goes reading a history mystery knows what kind of style to expect and what kind of a story, that it's mystery investigators but has humor. So what ends up happening with that series is I wrote the first 3 pretty much at breakneck speed, but each one needs at least 6 months of historical research. So after the 3rd book, I just wrote to my publishers. They were like, let's get the 4th one out. And I actually said, I need a break. I need to write something else to clear my head. Otherwise, I'll be writing about Akbar in Ashoka's time and something else going on in my own head. So, and I was a little worried that I don't want it to become formulaic in that sense, because each one has to stand on its own merit. So I think a little bit is dependent on what you're writing. And having said that, from a writer, and I would assume this is the same from a publisher's perspective, it does make it easier to market, and each new book in the series sort of supports the backlist that you already have, because you start talking about a new book in that, and it'll sort of build sales and remind people of the other ones in that series. So it definitely helps from that side. But as a reader, there's, as we mentioned, there's the comfort. But as a publisher, I think while the marketing would help, what I have heard is that it's also a little bit of a high-risk, high-reward game, right? If the first one or the first 2 don't do well and you've already signed the author on for a bunch more, it could go either way. So
I think series books are mostly character-driven, and then they take you to different locations and adventure and so on. But within our own list, we have a lot of non-fiction series, wherein what is really consistent and constant is basically the structure. So for instance, if we do a travelogue, you just have the basic premise of a travelogue where someone's traveling, but the locations, the history, the backstory is just so different and varied that I do think there is also a lot to offer. So it definitely depends on what your series is about. And in terms of the longevity or shelf life of that series, it's very important to bear in mind that you are thinking variety within it. So, you don't reach a point where readers feel bored, or they exactly anticipate that this is exactly what's going to happen. So I think with non-fiction, there might be a little more variety or something really beyond the structure to look forward to. And that's what we've done within our own list. We don't have a lot of fiction series, but we do have non-fiction series which lend themselves to many numbers, and then we can experiment, we can innovate within it, where the overarching theme and the structure are the same, but then the authors can really play around with the basic story. And I'd say that it differs from book to book, series to series. But as publishers, we usually keep in mind the long shelf life of that series when we sign up an author. Because you don't want to really invest in and put all the effort into doing something that you're taking a risk on, and like after 2 or 3 books, it'll fizzle out. Yeah. So it has to be.
Thank you, Shoini. Thank you for coming up and sharing your thoughts.
I have 2 boys. The elder one is a wide and varied reader. The younger one sticks to series. So I used to be very upset about it because he went through the entire series of Geronimo and then Dogman and Underpants. gave me a lot of heartburn, but he's an advanced reader, honestly, more advanced than the other one, because I think the series just got him hooked on, and then he grew up, he no longer reads them, he moved on. So I think it was more angst for me rather than for him. He enjoyed it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to quickly ask you a couple of questions and throw it open for questions after that. So are there any pitfalls? When we were talking earlier, David, you mentioned that, there's a possibility that as an author, we need to be true to ourselves and to our stories. And sometimes when we are under pressure on deadlines or we've signed up for a set number of books, you feel you have to churn out another story. And, creativity doesn't come at the push of a button. So what would you say are some of the drawbacks from a writer's point of view?
I think just that, actually. It can be difficult in that you do start to feel like you're churning them out. There is that danger, a significant danger. And I think for me, and it's the challenge for me as the Douglas books have continued, is to keep them fresh. And probably in hindsight, inevitably, I guess, with the 11 books, there's going to be some that I think work better than others. And I look back at some of the ones that I don't think work so well, and yeah, you just got to try and keep. It's difficult to keep that sharp all the time. And I'm not saying that my publisher insisted I do them, but maybe I should have just held back a bit. And I think in terms of, you've mentioned once or twice you needed a break. I think I probably should have done that, because just to have a little break is a good thing, and just come back again fresh. And I haven't done that. It's been a very happy journey, so I've enjoyed it. But I think in hindsight, the last 2 or 3 years have been a bit more challenging to keep them fresh. And as a writer and illustrator, it's important to do that for every book. Every book's got to be the best you can possibly do. I'm sure every author would say that. And of course, I've gone into that thinking that. But I just feel, again, hindsight really, you do feel restricted a little bit. And sometimes it's good to take a break. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would just say that as a writer, if you're writing a series, you really need to have the strength to stay the course at some times, which David has had a lot more than I have. And sort of balance that with a pushback, sometimes saying, I need time and I need a break. I think those are the two things which I would say. And having said that, I pretty much wish and pray that I get the character-based idea and I write one of those sometime, and then have the strength to literally stay the course. That's important.
Quickly open the floor to questions. Please address your question to the panelists. Who would you like to answer? I can see a hand right up here. Yes.
So I have two questions, if you don't mind. So one is that once a certain writer's done a specific amount of series, I see that sometimes those series are compiled into one book. Now, do you think that that's an effective way to put it across to a reader, or does that actually hinder the story process? And why do you put it in different books instead of just putting the series into one book from the start?
That's a great question. From my experience with the Douglas series, and there's one or two other picture books I've had series where they have been put in books, I would imagine it's more of a marketing thing. Certainly at the beginning, there's not, I don't think, they have first life. I think this is dipping in and out. Sorry, can you hear it? Yeah. Sorry, is that better? I think the idea of having them as a compilation is a nice way to reintroduce it to new readers and to have a kind of, what's the best way of putting it? Yeah, a new way of introducing it to new readers. But I don't think necessarily the intention there is, particularly for picture books, which is my experience, that you normally have 3 or 4 in one series. I think that's something that comes later. And I have had collections as a 3-in-1 book, for example, but I don't think publishers generally start with a 3-in-1 book, picture book series, in my experience, that I'm aware of anyway. I don't know. But that's one.
Yeah, I think, it's completely marketing driven. As a writer, when we write, we're not writing the stories thinking it's going to go into a compilation. There'll be individual books, so it doesn't affect your storytelling in any way. And once you have a large enough collection, sometimes it is that each book is priced at, say, 125, and you can club it into 3. It increases the ticket price that is being sold. It's literally just marketing. Sometimes it makes for a good gift. And if somebody picks it up and, you get 3 books together, you know that you're likely to hook the reader. So it's all largely publisher driven. It's not author driven in that.
I'm getting glares from the side, but we have time for 2 more questions.
I had a second question.
Who would like to ask?
Yeah, I had 2 questions. But that's okay, I don't need to ask.
Let me just see if anyone else has, and then we'll come back to you. Anybody else has a question? Oh, You're in luck. Come on.
Okay, so yeah, the second one was, so whenever I read a standalone book, I find that at the end there's always something more that I want to see. And whenever I look at a series, once I've read the first book and then they give out more books. So how do you know? So I did understand from the talk that it's sometimes the publisher asks you if you want to take it on as a series. But do you think that as readers, sometimes you want to see what happens next? So do you know when, even in a series, that last book that you've done, is it always a proper ending? Or even a standalone book, is it always a proper ending? Do you look at it as an ending, or do you look at it as, I'm done with that book, I just want the readers to enjoy that one moment of that character's life?
So I would say that for a standalone book, and I'm saying this not only as a writer but as a reader, as a writer, of course, if I'm really thinking of it as a standalone book, I should get it to some conclusion. But as a reader, sometimes you might be so invested in the characters that you just want to, you can't bear to leave them. So even though the book has really ended, you feel a void in your life. And that's fine. That's good, because the story had you invested so heavily in it. But in a series which perhaps has a, the arcing narrative across many books, at some point, if it's the last book and the author is very clear it's the last book, there would be something which ties up all the loose ends, I would assume. But
yeah, I think for me, in my experience, I do illustrate young fiction for slightly older kids, or outside picture books, and the series I've worked on has one series I think it was a 6-book series with an ending. There were tasks for the characters to do, and they performed it over the series, so that was very clearly as a sort of a set of 6. Others that I wrote one series which were standalones in terms of story, but the world was a series that's called Goblins, and each one was a different type of goblin. But again, it depends on the series. I think initially the Goblin ones, which were standalone within a series, that was thought of at the time as a set of 6. But I think it just depends on the success as well. I think if they're more standalone, and if the Goblins had done really, really well, they did okay, but not that well, they might have asked for another 6. But obviously, with a story arc over a set number of books, then obviously it's more obvious, isn't it, as to which way.
We have time for one more question. No one? Okay, I'm going to take that question then. So what do you think has been the role of social media and book series in terms of marketing, publicity, and creating awareness?
I think it's broadly a very positive thing, because obviously now a lot of readers have access to certainly the publishers in terms of possibly extra material, in terms of Q&A, interviews, videos, clips from the author, but also authors themselves are connected socially on social media. So, readers can connect with the readers, which I think is fantastic. And the idea of me talking to the artist of Asterix and Obelix, for example, when I was a kid, would have been amazing. So I think it must only be a great thing. And then you can get these fan base in Facebook, for example, then can generate interest and draw in new readers talking about a series. So I think it's a good thing.
I would completely agree. I think given we are perpetually cash-strapped in the industry, social media is great for standalones and series, but with series, the advantage, like I mentioned, was that with a 3rd book or a 4th book, it's supporting your entire backlist. So you actually, while you're talking about one, you're pretty much supporting 4 in the series, and therefore it makes it all much easier. And social media just helps bring it about, and then also develop and help the word of mouth that goes with it. So it's always a positive.
So thank you everyone for taking time out and joining us, and I hope you're going back as inspired as I am by both David and Natasha, and thank you for sharing your wonderful journeys with us.
Thank you.